Very good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. We have 36 of 104 so far logged in. So welcome, it's 12:31 and we are about to start webinar 2. Thank you to the approximately 100 attendees who attended webinar 1. Just by way of introduction, the first webinar, we had everything from, you might say, fresh graduates to PhDs. So we were covering a very wide span of experience, of expertise, of capability in agri-tech technology generally, agri-tech in particular, and a wide range of experience and exposure to the subjects of farm data standards and interoperability. So by definition, that meant we had to have somewhat of a broad spectrum in our material. And of course, that meant we were covering information that would be of interest to some and not necessarily others at the time. So thank you for giving us that opportunity to, you might say, bring a base level of understanding and context up. We also were able to open up the wiki to everybody. If you've all got access to that, that's great. If you didn't or haven't yet got access, by all means, email me. You've got my email in the links, and I'm happy to resend that invitation to the wiki. There is a vast amount of information in there which Jim has loaded up, and it will be a great resource both during the series of webinars and after. So for today, we are happy to move to the second of the 4 webinars, and most of you have already met Jim. Jim, as you know, is the Chief Technology Officer of Open Applications Group, which is a pan-industry standards and interoperability organisation. He's also the Chief Technology Officer of AgGateway, which is the same, but with a, in simple terms, but with a focus specifically on agriculture. So we're a couple of minutes into our 90 minutes. So Jim, I'm happy to hand over to you. We've also got Tim Cutfield on the line curating Q&A. And Andrew Cooke waiting in the wings to join us at the appropriate spot in today's agenda to bring a particular depth of expertise and understanding from the New Zealand context with particular reference to New Zealand Farm Data Standards and Data Linker. Jim, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenneth. So this is, as Kenneth said, this is the second of 4 scheduled webinars. Also, since the webinar last Tuesday, I presented at Mobile Tech, and that was a treat. And so with our topic this week, or topics, we're going to address process and data standards. Then next week we'll address data rights and data management, which will get into things like reference data and moving data around, data transport and routing, things like that. And then in the final webinar, we'll address application benefits for New Zealand and ITP, and I will be more of a bystander and occasional commenter during that session. So, welcome. A few points before diving into the content like last week. Okay, as Kenneth mentioned, I set up some content on a wiki. You all should have an account. There were 29 new registrants for today. I added you all to the wiki, and you should have received an automated email inviting you to just sign on. So anyway, like last week, you're welcome to make comments at the bottom of any page or make comments in line. We had a person last week who helpfully commented that, hey, OGC, the Open Geospatial Consortium, they make some good standards. So it would have been nice to see them in the list. And so I added them promptly. And then, of course, I'll be adding more content for the other webinars and making updates to existing content. There's a lot of content to put in there. I want to thank the people who have made this possible, in particular PAANZ and AgriTech New Zealand. Thanks in particular to Kenneth. He's been tireless in helping shape the content despite my stubbornness to insist on making certain points. Also, Mobile Tech Ag, who has been gracious both this year and last year in promoting workshops. And then, as Kenneth said, I'm CTO with AgGateway, and they support my efforts, and they overlap considerably with my role as President and CEO of the Open Applications Group. Okay, so just a few key terms and their relationships to start off here. So today, I'll be using terms like process, diagram, model. There is a distinction between those terms, and I would ask you to just be a little forgiving in maybe me not being exactly precise. Most people won't even notice, but really a process is something you do, and a model is some representation of the process. And generally, a diagram is, you can think of it as a type of model or a representation of a model. So in particular, I'll mix and match diagram and model. The distinction matters, but not for today. Also, user story and use case. If I use user story, I'm using it in a general, just everyday, write me a paragraph kind of story. I'm not talking about user story in the agile sense. And there's more detailed information in the wiki about these terms and their distinctions. And then finally, data, information, message, document, payload, instance. I may mix those up. I'll try to be consistent, but that's just how the conversations roll out sometimes. So data and information they're not exactly the same, but they're more or less synonyms for our discussion today. Message is kind of, you can think of it as a chunk of data that goes from one system to another. Sometimes people will refer to a message as a document. Hotshot, web-oriented developers might push back on that and say, oh, we're not messing with big documents, we're messing with messages. Okay, got it. Also, you'll hear the word payload, and then even instance, which when you hear instance, that's usually to be juxtaposed and distinguished from schema. So you have a schema that talks about how a message is defined, and then an instance, something that conforms to the schema, sort of like you have a blueprint and a house. The blueprint's the schema, the house is the instance. Okay, enough said about those terms. I'm sorry, one more. So I may say all sorts of stuff like something exchange, data exchange, information exchange, message exchange. They're all interrelated. It's moving data from one system to another system, and maybe one party system to another party system. And then transport and routing, that's all in the context of moving data around. And they have relationships with web services and APIs. But we're not going to get into those things today. I may mention them to provide context in terms of process and messages, but we'll cover those topics more next week. Okay, last week I addressed interoperability centrality. Without interoperability, you can't create value, or it's really hard to. And standards enable interoperability. So just to give you some perspective of what we're covering, this green block here represents the 6 hours of interoperability workshops we're conducting. And that little blue slice represents a sliver that is associated with about 24 hours of aerospace and defense interoperability workshops that I'm doing this week. And earlier today, about 4 hours ago, I completed the first 6 hours of that. So we are really flying high here, covering ground. But hopefully this will give you a taste for what interoperability is all about and what we can do. So next topic is context. Context is really important in interoperability. It gives shape to process descriptions. It gives shape and scope to your data requirements. It always matters. Sometimes, often, it's intuitive, obvious, and consequently not worth explicitly identifying. But when in doubt, call it out. And the context has a close relationship with scope. So let me give you an example. You can define supply chain processes for ag inputs, okay? Or just supply chain processes in general. Well, if you try to take a general supply chain process and apply it to North America, and more specifically the United States, and more specifically seed supply chain related processes, the context is richer and richer and more detailed, and that allows you to define the standards more explicitly. And then, of course, an element of context can be New Zealand. Okay. Okay, so let's dive into processes. Okay, processes are critical. This should be pretty obvious to you, but just running through the list here, if you don't have process, you don't have business, you don't have process improvement, competitive advantage, you don't have a need for data, you don't have a need for customer suppliers, and you don't create value. So obviously process is critical. Friday is the 3 high-level flows. So you have products and services, they're part of a process and they flow. Then you have money flowing, and then you have information flow. And of course, we're going to focus on information flow, but keep in mind that information flow is always in the context of these other flows. All right, so a key aspect of sorting out interoperability with respect to processes is words and pictures. It is really important, sometimes critical, to document your processes in words and pictures. Okay, words, just a story. Just get somebody who knows what they're talking about, get a domain expert, let them talk. Everybody else listen and take notes. In my experience, there's an awful lot of people who don't know domains well. They get in a room and they speculate for a long time. Just get the right people and let them talk. Tell a story. And so again, you've got stories. You can formalize it a little more with use cases. And you can have an agile style user story, which I told you earlier, but that really doesn't get at processes. That's more about kind of software features and things like that. And then pictures. Frankly, just back of the napkin is a good start, but you will want to get more formal. So one aspect of creating diagrams for processes is you have sort of an intuitive approach and you have a standard approach. And what I've heard over the years is anytime I encourage people to take a standard, more rigorous approach, there's always pushback like, oh, Jim, you're making things too complicated. Why do I need, I just want to keep it simple, keep it intuitive. Well, there's a challenge with that. Random shapes and colors are great for children's cereal, but not process diagrams. And often what you get with intuitive diagrams is you get just a rainbow of colors and crazy shapes. And when you ask the author what a color means or what a shape means or why a line is dashed versus solid, sometimes they have an answer that is not intuitive and not documented, or they have no answer at all. They just felt like it. So in the late, around 2008, I guess, I led a group in Geneva, Switzerland, where the group was evaluating European logistics standards for industrial chemicals. And one major chemical company produced such a diagram. They had all sorts of colors, solid lines, dashed lines, and gave it to the group to validate. And everybody else in the group was just trying to be a team player and said they agreed. And so I started to probe and ask what this meant, what that meant. And it came out that what other people thought, when a diagram isn't a standard diagram, anybody can take a diagram any way they want. And so it turned out that they were not all on the same page, and we had to sort it out. Intuitive diagrams are not so intuitive when it comes to process diagrams. It's not so common sense. Just a warning on use of color. If you do use color, always provide a legend and be mindful of color blindness. It's okay to use colors. Colorblind people typically understand that, other people use it, but just keep in mind that the legend needs to be able to make that distinction. So one of the big standards or set of standards for process modeling are UML, Unified Modeling Language, and BPMN, the Business Process Modeling and Notation. And those standards are provided by the Object Management Group. And just trust me when I say they're well accepted. Now, some people think they're overkill, some people don't like to use them, but in terms of what's generally accepted out there, these are it. Now with UML, you have sequence models and diagrams, state models and diagrams, and activity models and diagrams. And we'll show you example of a couple of them, not all of them. And then business process, BPMN, business process modeling and notation diagrams. And there's various submodels with those. Okay, again, as with the story, get somebody who knows what they're talking about and listen to them. Write down what they say. Speculation wastes time and leads to poor results. When you write your process definitions or document things, estimate the value of composing formal written use cases. It may turn out not to be worth it. Also, create a diagram. Perhaps start with a sequence diagram, but at some point determine if you'll address the as-is process, the to-be process, or both. Often you'll do both. How do we do things today? How do we want to do things in the future? What is the investment required to make the transition? What's the value of making the transition? And should you do it? And also estimate the value of BPMN model and diagrams. So with that, let me show you a couple of examples, and then we're going to, then I want to bring Kenneth into the conversation to talk about a New Zealand specific one. So, okay, so this is the wiki, okay? And so this is the 21 April workshop. And if we drill down, there's all sorts of stuff under business processes here. And I go into some details about writing stories, user stories, written use cases with some examples provided. Okay. And then there's also models and diagrams here. So let's just look at sequence diagram. Okay, so here's a very simple one. And we saw a sequence diagram last week. So there are two parties here, or two systems in this case, within an enterprise. And this is just a simple Salesforce automation order inquiry. So you want to get the sales order and you want to show the sales order. All right, very, very simple, two messages. This is a more involved example, and a team at OAGi completed this on Friday. It's a pandemic readiness and response one. And we're not going to get into this in detail at all, but the bottom line is, how do you discover new test methods, define them in the appropriate way, deliver them in the United States to the Centers of Disease Control for them to review, approve it, and then get those approved tests out to labs so that they can start implementing tests. So, of course, this would be something that could apply to COVID-19. And then moving on to business process diagrams, we have, I have a diagram here that is in a PDF form, and you can download that. Just let me be clear, this is a work in progress. It was just updated a few days ago, and it's pretty involved, okay? This is around soil testing. And of course, we're not going to go through this, but the point here is just notice how much more detailed and how much more symbology is present in this diagram. BPMN really lets you get down into a lot of detail and nuance about your business processes. All right, so this is one, and now let's look at another one quickly. This is a scenario that Land O'Lakes uses for their dairy testing, for I think it's cheese testing or something. And let me blow that up a little. And this is a tool called Digital Enterprise Suite from Trisatech. They allow AgGateway and OAGi to use their tool for free, but in turn we give them a free membership. So I guess it's an exchange. And you know, this has some detail. It's not quite as involved as the one I just showed you, but one really interesting tool feature of this sort of tool is it has an animator. So you can say, I'm going to start, and you can say, okay, I want to move that one forward. I'm going to move that process forward. I'm going to move that process forward, and I'm going to take this path, and I'm going to take this path, and I'm going to take this path. I'm going to go here, and that kicks off some messages to these other parties, and so on and so forth. We'll stop there, but you know, tools like this allow you to visualize the process flow in the interactivity. So with that, let me shift gears and let's bring Kenneth into the conversation. Let me switch back to the presentation here, and Kenneth put together a diagram that definitely falls in the category of pretty pictures. And Kenneth, you want to talk a little bit about what's going on here?
Thank you, Jim. This schema was to help us focus on just one of many ag-specific applications, and it really is a demonstration of what one would normally start with if you just start with a blank sheet of paper and you haven't got any guidance, you haven't got any reference points, you haven't got any prior knowledge. Anybody could write this. And so why we put this together like this is, yeah, it's got some information in it. Yes, it's maybe a bit of a descriptor, but it's very thin. And if you wanted to penetrate in behind it and actually get any understanding about what's actually going on in this what's called a nutrient loop, it really isn't a lot of help. It's a classic start point. So what we wanted to do today was to put this forward as this is what anybody could write. That literally is 10 minutes work, and anybody could do that with a a decent understanding of what happens with a farmer in green, a fertilizer co-op in blue, technology provider in purple, contractor in buff, and a regulator in dark blue. You'd start somewhere at 12 o'clock and say, right, a farmer has got a farm map and he or she's got some records. An agronomist or the fertilizer co-op nutrient specialist would do a classic science step, which is usually a 4-step process of soil test, nutrient budget, fertilizer plan, application plan. This schema, of course, doesn't tell you any of what's going on behind. So take Jim's prior slide about soil test. What we'd really want to be able to do with this schema is to click on soil tests and drill in behind it to expose a way more detailed sub-schema, which of course this simple picture doesn't do. That information comes back to the farmer from the nutrient specialist. That enables her to now place an order for product and an order for application. Application being where is the product going to go, on what date and what paddocks at what rate and by what contractor. That information can flow through into the mixing plant. That means when the contractor bottom right gets the order, they know which bulk store to go to, they know which bin to pull up underneath, so the bin knows which truck to put the order into, who to invoice for the products, whether it's going out via a commercial ground spreader, whether it's going out via aviation spreading, or whether it's being taken away by the farmer to put in a silo or into a storage bin, or to be applied then or later with self-spreading equipment on the farm. At some point, that application is going to take place. You need two systems to help do that. One is the guidance system, which points the application in the right direction, and a tracking system which records the actual proof of the actual application, what's called as applied rather than as intended data. So you may have an intention of applying 80 kilograms of urea on 10 hectares, but you may finish up spreading 70 kilos per hectare on 10.5 hectares. So you create an audit quality report, which is the proof of application file. That can then be curated along with other nutrient data such as effluent data, effluent originated N for nitrogen in particular. That can come back to the GIS platform held by the fertilizer co-op, It can be stored there or by the farmer, and one or both of those can then export that data for a variety of uses, for example, compliance reporting. That's a very simple overview. What Jim and I are going to do now from here is that between now and next week, we will take that beginner's guide to the galaxy and we will put it through Jim's process, and then next week we will show you what that actually looks like and how much more informative it is, and how all of those different parties then can be informed about how they can interact with that schema, but in a much more intelligent and constructive and commercially efficient manner.
Okay, great, Kenneth. It does occur to me that I guess my previous comments may have set the stage for a critical view of this in terms of Lucky Charms and multiple colors. But you did explain your colors up there. So you have colors and you have your legend at the top. So that's good. And again, any back of the napkin diagram to kick things off is the way to go. It is absolutely fascinating, the power of a diagram and people around it who can draw on it and talk about it and say, no, this arrow goes here instead of there. Oh, you're forgetting somebody, and they draw a circle and write a name. It's good stuff. And hopefully this isn't surprising to you. The real point is, don't assume that what is intuitive to you is intuitive or intuitive in the same way as other people. It's interesting, in all the years I've been doing this standards related things, I've always emphasized documenting processes. Also in all those years I've been doing it, there's only been one time where I have experienced an inability to document a process, and that was in the grain industry, and we were documenting the settlement process for grain settlements. So we documented the process of establishing contracts, taking weights and grades, all sorts of stuff, shipments, grain shipments. But when it came to settlements, that was an absolute zoo, an absolute jungle. We couldn't do it. But one thing was true, everybody agreed on what the data looked like. So it's like, okay, we'll just chalk that up as an exception. So moving on, we've talked about processes and how important they are, how to document them in words and pictures, talked about some standard approaches, covered a couple of examples Kenneth shared with you. Now let's shift gears and talk about data. Okay, again, like last week, a word on completeness. I'm not going to cover everything. Everything I tell you now is noteworthy, but not everything that's noteworthy is mentioned. So see the stuff online and feel free to post some comments about what you'd like to see there. Okay, so I did cover this on Friday, but it is essential to what we're talking about now. If we think about how information is exchanged or data is exchanged, we have a sender and a receiver. A sender could be a manufacturer and a receiver can be a distributor. You could have a sender be a piece of equipment in the field and a receiver be a farm management information system in the farm office. It could be two ERP systems within a giant aerospace and defense company. Okay, so first thing is you need to know what the required information is that would be sent in some sort of information exchange. And of course, this is determined upfront, like you know it when you need to send information. So you pull the info out of your system, you express that information in some form. You may transform the information into an agreed upon format. So let's just stop here. So let's say it's a purchase order. So you may pull purchase order information together in your system. You may output it in SAP iDoc. Let's say if your company uses SAP. Then let's say you use an agreed upon format, maybe UBL or OAGi, and you transform it into that format. Then you may, or probably do, want to validate the message, and validate message has a specific meaning. and that means to confirm that the content of the message conforms with the schema agreed upon. All right. If it's supposed to have a header, does it have a header? If you have a quantity, does it have a unit of measure? Just all those sort of things that go into a standard. Generally, you'll digitally sign the message, or that could be in various layers in an information exchange. But digitally sign the message and then send the message. Okay, then it goes to the other party and it hits some sort of API. And generally somewhere right behind the API in the service, the service that the API exposes, some authentication and authorization is confirmed there. And then the data makes its way into the receiver. And of course, the receiver receives the message, validates the digital signature, checks to make sure it can actually read the message. Just if it's XML or all the angle brackets there that are supposed to be there, is it readable? Then perform initial validation that conforms or that aligns with number 5 on the other side. Is the message received? Does it conform with the specified schema? And then transform it into a preferred internal format, and then do some sort of business validation. Did they just order 3,000 tractors? If they did, maybe they have the wrong part number and they didn't mean to. And then ingest it in the system and process it. So today, for this session, we're going to talk about number 4, number 5 on the left, and just number 4 on the right. All the stuff, all these other things many of these other things, notably the transport and routing, and then some of the business validation, we'll talk about next week. All right, so anatomy of a data standard. So this is the data that would be sent across the wire. Using all my terminology from earlier, it's the information sent, the data sent, the message, the payload, the instance, all those things. So messages have names like purchase order. They'll often have a version, or the schema associated with the message will have a version. The data standard will have structures defined. So you'll have a purchase order and you'll say, okay, there's purchase order, and then the purchase order has a header and line items, and within line items you'll have products and quantities. And within the header you're going to have a buyer and a seller. So that's what we mean by structure. What does the hierarchy of the message look like? And then we'll have types, so strings, numbers, dates, Boolean values, code lists, identifier schemes. These define what the data looks like. Quantities are going to be numbers, undoubtedly. Requested ship date, that's going to be a date. Ship complete flag, like don't ship the order unless you can ship all of it. Ship complete flag, that would be a Boolean. And then code lists, like country codes, currency codes, commodity codes, all sorts of things. And then there's your good old string, just names and addresses and things like that. And then finally, identifier schemes. So that would be things like GS1's global trade item number or global location number. And AgGateway has a reference data service and database that provides, in partnership with GS1, provides those sorts of identifiers to the industry in North America. And then finally, semantics. And I have a nice iceberg image, but I'm going to save that for next week. We'll dig into the types and the semantics more next week, but at the end of the day, comprehending what the data means is the biggest challenge. You tell a developer, hey, we have this data, can you pull it into our system so we can run analysis on it? And the developer looks at it like, man, I don't know what this means, I don't know what that means, who can I ask? Semantics is a big deal. So next week we'll talk about what we can do about that. And then we have syntax. So syntax is often hotly debated, but it's not that big a deal for veterans. At the end of the day, data is data. If you understand it, that's the hard part. Whether it's JSON, XML, EDI, those things matter less. All right, so let's get into some examples of it. So we have the New Zealand Farm Data Standards. And by the way, today we're just going to focus on the left one, just the Farm Data Standards, not the two companion standards and service. And we're not going to talk about it right now because Andrew is going to join me here in a few minutes, and we're going to dive into this a little bit. Okay, there's another standard is OAGi. That's from OAGi. It's the Open Application Group Integration Specification. It's an ISO 15000 Part 5 compliant comprehensive canonical standard for enterprise level processes. This is the topic of all my 24 hours of training this week, just this standard, and a little bit about the processes around it. It covers lower level processes as well. It has over 75 documented processes. And we just saw one, the pandemic readiness one. And it has actually, I checked today, it's like 1,211 defined messages. And it also has a tool called SCORE, and I'll demo that here in a few minutes. Very quickly, and it supports XML, JSON, and whatever syntax comes next. You know, something will come down the road and be the next greatest thing. Okay, next one is AgGi standards and AgXML. So AgGateway publishes AgGi standards, and that is an exact copy of Chemi standards. Chemi standards is for industrial chemicals, and it works really well for ag inputs. So the agriculture industry uses it as well. AgGi standards are supply chain oriented messages. Another standard is AgXML. I mentioned that earlier. That addresses grain processes, which includes contracts and settlements, shipments, weights and grades. And then AgGi standards and AgXML are fairly rigid, and they're XML only. And so by rigid, I mean they're not extensible. So if they don't meet your need, there's not a lot of wiggle room to bend it to your will. You'll just have to sort of contribute recommended changes. On the flip side, OAGi, which we just talked about, is super flexible, and it's really, really good. All right, the next one comes from AgGateway, and it's ADAPT, AgGateway's open source project. ADAPT is a toolkit for transforming data from and to various field operations data formats to and from a common data model called the ADAPT data model. The ADAPT data model, the center of ADAPT, can be serialized to files, or if you're a real geek on the call here, yes, it can be serialized to a stream. And then the serialized form of the ADAPT data model is not presently, as of April 2020, a standard. However, a number of companies use it as a data exchange format. So they'll pull data out of their system using ADAPT. They'll express it in the ADAPT format using an ADAPT plugin, and then they'll ship data from their FMIS to an agronomist for analysis, or maybe an insurance company for records of what they've done on the farm, things like that. And so given the interest in using the ADAPT data model in its serialized form in that way, AgGateway has started a standardization process. What would it mean for ADAPT to be a standard? And so, Kenneth, maybe I could pause here. Is this something? It sounds like from what you were saying earlier, this might be something interesting for New Zealand to look into about how they may weigh in on this sort of tool and whether it becomes a standard.
Yes, thank you, Jim. I can contribute a bit. Under the Precision Ag Association auspices, a subcommittee of the organisation, chaired by me, joined by Tim Cutfield, Brendan O'Connell, and Dr. Callum Eastwood from DairyNZ, did some preliminary analysis a couple of years ago on a range of standards that were available to New Zealand to contemplate, and that paper was reasonably widely circulated and generally found favour. There was no really great objection to it, What didn't come from it was any kind of decision that resulted in broad-based acceptance of the AgGateway standards as a useful format for that. I've got to say that in the last 6 months or less, particularly since the pre-publication of the Industry Transformation Plan, which I'll expand on in just a second, there's been a significant rise in commitment, engagement, cross-party discussions. Some of that came from the full-day seminar that we ran in conjunction, that you led in conjunction with Mobile Tech in Rotorua last year, and this year's Mobile Tech event would have seen another day-long in-person seminar, which is what we converted to the function last Thursday. I think merely the fact that there are over 100 people registered for this series is just yet another evidence that the time is rapidly arising in a confluence between, or convergence between, government, regional and local, regional and central, I should say, and between industry, research, academia, industry good bodies, large and small commercial operations, that there is increasing recognition that to serve the primary sector, to enable farming to maximise its contribution to New Zealand well-being, both in terms of food production and food provenance, and in terms of efficiency and proof of provenance for domestic and international consumption, that we now, in a post-pandemic period, have a very different context in which to see the merits of ascribing to a set of common standards, especially those that have been very broadly accepted by a couple of hundred of the major global agri-tech companies like Syngenta and Bayer Crop Science and John Deere and Topcon and Trimble and Ag Leader and many others around the world. So we'll cover this in particular in webinar 4, and I'm looking forward especially to inviting David Downs, who's currently trying to clear out a government meeting commitment that he's got so that he can join us in 2 weeks from today to speak to the Industry Transformation Plan, which he and I jokingly referred to yesterday. I said it feels to me like it is a transformed Industry Transformation Plan, because government has now got its hands more than full than it ever had before managing current and post-pandemic governance. And so a lot of the resources, effort, capacity, people that were available within MPI, the Ministry for the Environment, MFAT and MB are now going to have to be redirected to far more important work. And I think there's a number of us, many of us in this webinar audience and across a wider portfolio of people, are recognising not only the merits of common standards that are aligned with global best practice, but also there's an increased drive for both a self-preservation or self-interest, let's say, perspective within companies, which is a legitimate driver. But we also see the greater good of being able to operate efficiently, accurately, and to interoperate domestically across the country and importing, exporting. So I think there's a general mood increasing, and if that's any evidence, if the following's any evidence, talking to David Downs yesterday, he invited me to write a short, sharp email that he wanted to circulate around a meeting he happened to be having with senior officials in MPI today, as to how we could see some reset around the balance between government and industry and how we move forward from here compared to how we were perhaps 2 or 3 months ago when the Industry Transformation Plan first came out for public consultation.
All right, yeah, sounds like a lot going on. Thanks, Kenneth. So while Kenneth was talking, I brought up the repository. I just want to emphasize that, you know, there's lots of standards out there, and there are lots of tools out there. This tool is, again, it's open source. You can see here that what this means here, EPL-1.0, that is the license under which AgGateway offers this. It's the Eclipse public license. It's very business friendly. It's basically take it, use it, do what you will with it. You don't need to give credit, I don't think, or you definitely don't have to give back your code. But then, of course, if things blow up, don't, come calling on AgGateway about it. But this project has been incredible. This is sort of the nougaty center, adapt itself, and the adapt data model lives in there. John Deere did the bulk of the early work on this, and then Sandra sort of handed over the reins to some other companies, including CNH and AGCO. TopCon funded development of this plugin, and this makes it compatible with ISOXML, which is kind of the common name for the format associated with ISO 11783 Part 10, and I have my next slide addresses that. And you can see the activity. I mean, we updated this repository 5 days ago. Somebody made changes to it. This also, some of these other ones not, this was like, I don't know, a month ago or so. And then these not so much, the visualizer and the samples. But you can dig in. I mentioned earlier that AgGateway is starting a process to standardize these languages, or standardize the adapt data model. And so one of the reasons is that some people observe, they're like, hey, we don't really blame you for choosing C#. So C# is one of Microsoft's .NET programming languages. But hey, it's Microsoft. And some people are Java shops. Some are Python, or maybe even Ruby, or maybe even JavaScript nowadays. And they're like, man, do you have something that's sort of a generic standard associated with this stuff that we could develop this work in the language of our choice? And so that's why we're going down that path. So you can explore this. It's free. You can download it and contribute to it tomorrow if you want. So back to our presentation. And as promised, we will go to...
Jim, excuse me just for a second. Yeah. Jim, can I just pick up on a question that I think's just valuable to respond to in context? Shane's just raised a question that Tim's passed on. Shane's with the viticulture industry. Could you just talk briefly, obviously that the example that I used before was from a broadacre agricultural context. Is there a number of people from other sectors of the ag sector broadly defined, horticulture, viticulture, apiculture here, don't recognise anybody from agriculture, but it may well be the case. Can you just speak more broadly about these very important contributors to GDP in New Zealand, but worldwide as well, to the extent to which the adoption of AgGateway or other standards has moved intelligence, wisdom, experience across these subsets within the broadest definition of agriculture, with particular reference to viticulture?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I almost got into it, and it's like, in the interest of time, I'll just sort of hold back on that a little bit. But yeah, that's a really good question. AgGateway's history is it grew out of an organization that focused on agricultural input supply chain. And then we grew to cover more sectors of the industry, and then we began addressing field operations. Not just equipment on fields, but also irrigation. With respect to livestock and dairy, we pretty much at the moment just kind of touch it on the supply chain parts of feed-related operations. Not much more into that. With respect to horticulture, first of all, it depends on how you define horticulture. Typically in the US, when people talk about horticulture, in my experience, it's often about ornamentals and things like that, flowers. But in other parts of the world, clearly horticulture includes things like, fresh fruits and stuff like that. Our standards can apply in those areas. We know that some of our members are using them for horticulture, notably Syngenta. But we don't have any evidence that what we've done so far works for example, for dairy or livestock, other than maybe the feed elements of that. Now, having said that, there is a lot of interest in how we can take ADAPT as a data model, as a transformation tool, and expand that data model to address some of these other agricultural sectors. And so
Yeah,
I think there will be a time where people are going to make a decision. Are we going to jump on this bandwagon and make a model that's already useful with transformational tools built around it and improve upon it? Or are we going to do our own thing? And
maybe that's something that Andrew can cover. Andrew will bring, when we refer across to Andrew shortly, and in particular in webinar 4, what there's a broad recognition is that New Zealand's got a lot to contribute, not only gain from global interconnectivity and global relationships, starting with deeper relationships with Australia, but also more broadly. But also, not only can we benefit, we can also contribute, particularly in red meat, dairy, and rotational grazing. So let's just hold that thought, and we might expand on that a bit for Shane and others after we've spoken to after Andrew's contributed it shortly. But also, we will touch on this in some more detail on webinar 4. That's got a very much a New Zealand focus to it.
Yeah, I mean, make no mistake, in AgGateway, we're really proud of what we've accomplished. We're proud of the organization we have and how well we operate, how well resourced we are, how fine-tuned our operations are. But on the other side, we're pretty humble in recognizing the extent of the applicability of our resources. We are also very happy to point to existing resources and say, hey, world, in AgGateway's view, use our standards here, use these other standards over here. Here's how they interrelate. No sense in reinventing the wheel. You are tilting at windmills if you think you are going to create the next standard that will harmonize all the standards before it. It just doesn't work that way. And so anyway, yeah, it'll be really interesting. And I agree. I think the conversation 2 weeks from today should be very interesting. I hope we can get into it. Okay, so let's move on. We'll fly through a couple more standards, and then we'll get into a really brief demonstration of profiling a message. It's all set up and ready to go. So ISOXML, I've already touched on that. That is, ISOXML is the commonly used name for the XML syntax expression of ISO 11783 Part 10, which is field operations data. It's managed by the AEF, the Agriculture Industry Electronics Foundation, and it's published by ISO. AgGateway and AEF work very closely together to make sure that we either don't overlap, or where we do, we're really complementary in the way we are. That standard is machine-oriented, and that is in contrast to agronomy-oriented or business-oriented, although I suppose some may debate that. I'm just told that by a lot of people I trust. AgGateway's open source project ADAPT includes an open source ISOXML plugin. I mentioned that a moment ago. Moving on to some other standards, UNCFACT has some XML schemas based on the harmonized core component library, and which is based on the core component technical spec. I led the working group that produced the latest version of that technical spec. They also publish EDIFACT, which is outside the United States, probably the most popular EDI format. In the United States, it's the ANSI ASC X12 EDI format. Another one is UBL, and that comes from Oasis. A lot of people sort of suggest that UBL and OAGi from the company I lead compete with one another. But hey, at the end of the day, it's really good. UBL is good. It's accepted in at least Europe and parts of Asia, and you can read about it. One quote I want to share with you. I was at the ISO TC 154 meeting in Luxembourg in October. And I was there with the general counsel for Oasis, and we were talking about the perceived competition between the two standards. And he had a fantastic statement. And again, this person's name is Jamie Clark, General Counsel for Oasis. He said, you know what? At the end of the day, interoperability is all in the dark. And we just ought to be happy when somebody lights a candle and not worry about what color the candle is. And so, yeah, I agree with that. So, hey, look at UBL. If it works for you, implement it. Moving on, ICAR. We touched on ICAR, the organization, and mentioned they have data standards. They do. They claim to leverage UNCFAC standards. I don't know much about it. I do look forward to looking into it. I know ICAR matters a lot, for example, to the Dutch and their dairy industry and livestock industry. I don't know how it might relate to New Zealand standards. And then there's others. There's GS1 has some data standards. We'll get into more of their reference data stuff next week, their identifier schemes. There's AgriTechNZ Europe based in France. I mentioned earlier ANSI ASC X12 EDI, and many, many others. So with that, let me do a quick demo. And I'm not going to have time to get into the detail I wanted to, but that's okay. So some standards are big. So in the training that I did earlier today with the aerospace and defense industry, we brought up a purchase order from OAGi. And by the way, what I'm showing you is an OAGi standard. We generated a sample instance document that took every path. The sample instance document, in terms of just lines, was over, I think, 320,000 lines. Okay, now you don't measure a document size generally by lines, but you know if it has 320,000 lines, it's big. So the OAGi standard is enormous. Now, you can't give a developer an enormous standard and say, hey, run with this, integrate, let's be standard. You got to give them some guidance. And so OAGi, with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is part of, it's an agency of the United States Department of Commerce, we worked together over the last several years to develop a tool. And again, this tool is conformant with ISO 15000 Part 5, the core component spec. And that's the spec that I led the development of, or the latest version of. So here we're going to look at a message called notify shipment. And you can think of that as like ship notice, okay? Or it is ship notice. Because OA just uses a verb-noun combination. Then the verb is notify, the noun is shipment. And so if we look at this, we can say hide unused here. And let me blow this up so you all can see it well. And here it just has, you can drill down and look at what this standard says. Okay, there's a header, there's a ship from party, a ship to party, a shipment item. You can see there's a G10 ID. Again, that comes from GS1. And AgGateway has a reference database that contains G10s. Also, there are identifiers for ship from parties, and here I've said that I've added some notes here that this is a GLN, a global location number from the scheme agency, GS1. Okay, so there's not much going on here. Now, if we had everything selected, this message would be, again, enormous, okay? But we pick the parts we want, and we can say express BIE. So I'm going to pick this. And by the way, BIE, that's business information entity. That's sort of geek speak related to the core component spec. This tool is not terribly intuitive. Right now, it's just standard compliance. We're going to work on intuitiveness later. Okay, so we want to do notify shipment. And actually, if we go to the bottom here, we want to generate the BIE, and we want it to be an XML schema form. So now if I go here, here's my notify shipment, and here it is. So instead of being thousands of lines long, it's 102 lines, okay? And we chose a method of expression that's just a standalone expression here. So that's why it's so indented. But it's this sort of thing is very intuitive for developers to work with. Now you might think, oh, well, that's great, Jim, but hey, I need a batch number or a lot number. Okay, no problem. We can go in here. We can go back in here to view BIE. Again, BIE, business information entity. And we can drill down, and I'm not hiding unused now. I'm showing everything, going into data area, going under shipment, going under shipment item. And you can see there's all sorts of stuff here we can add. So let's say we want to add lot number. We pick that. And we want a lot identifier, and we're just going to leave it at that. And so we update it. And now we want to go back here and express it. Okay, so let's move on and let's turn our attention. I told you a minute ago that we wanted to come back to the New Zealand farm data standards and have a conversation with Andrew. So Andrew, I was looking at the farm data standards over the weekend, and again, we're going to focus. Sorry about that. We're going to focus on the farm data standards, and if we need to touch on the other two for context, that's fine. But if we go to this website, and let me blow this up a little bit. You know, I look around and I go to data standards. Here's farm data standards. And I open up one of these documents, let's say land application data standards, and it triggers a download of a very nice looking PDF file. And open that up. And I look through it, and it looks like you guys have a lot of, a lot of helpful kind of data dictionary type stuff. And the thing that occurs to me is, hey, I want to implement this. So where's the schema? Where does it tell me what the message looks like?
Yeah, and lovely question, Jim. When we started working on the farm data standards, we thought we would try and get a bit of a logical progression from when we started, and it was 2012, 2013, I think. There was a bunch of people we got together in a room, and we waved our arms about and we drew. We sketched, what did you call them? Intuitive diagrams. And we knew we needed to get beyond that. And so we said, well, what we actually need is some sort of common way of I guess getting the semantics right. And Jim, you touched on semantics earlier, and I see Tim Cutfield sent me a private message saying I need to do an intro of myself. So Jim, I'm going to interrupt and do a very brief intro of myself. Hi, I'm Andrew Cooke. I'm Managing Director of Rezare Systems, and I've been working in this space in New Zealand, creating software and creating data exchanges between organisations for 20 plus years, probably closer to 30 years, and a lot of the work that I'm talking about with farm data standards actually comes out of projects that were funded by MPI through the Primary Growth Partnerships, Beef and Lamb New Zealand, Dairy New Zealand, and other organisations. So there we go. There's the intro in the background.
You beat me to it, Andrew. I was just about to jump in and do it for you, so I'm glad. I couldn't have done it better myself. So thank you.
All good. And so back to your question, Jim. What we were trying to do here was kind of lay out the semantics or the meanings of the data components, because we tended to wave our arms around and say, hey, we need to share data about fertilizer or about animals, but different people meant different things by that data. And even when we got into it and we got people together in a conference room, because that's how we did those things back then, people said, well, we mean different things when we talk about classes of stock or ages of animals or all of those sorts of things. It's what Kenneth would point out to me as a North Island, South Island differentiation. And we saw that as we worked around the world, we've seen that on steroids. So the farm data standards were intended to bring that together and give the cut through to a common language, a common meaning that you could then start to build messages and other things on top of. And data linker, which we'll come back to maybe in another call, is the way we've been creating messages and also process flows for sharing data using those messages. Whereas the farm data standards really are, as you've seen them, they're a data dictionary. But I wonder, Jim, whether Kenneth would allow me to be a presenter and just share my screen.
Yeah,
very briefly, and I can.
While we're making that transition, so the image on my screen is components of an observation, and if I might make a connection to last week, it's kind of funny. There's a mention of OGC there, and I mentioned last week that in AgGateway's irrigation standards, we were doing observation and measurement stuff, and we took some inspiration from some work done in Japan by a group called Alpha, who referenced work in an ISO standard that Simon Cox from CSIRO was the lead editor for, and we engaged CSIRO to help us do us being AgGateway, do our irrigation standard. So I'm telling you, if people are willing to work together, the links are there to be effective. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
So
that's very true. And right, so what you can see there is a screen that you'll find at https://datalinker.org, but I'm interested in this View Farm Data Standards button because what we've done is we've moved things on. We haven't quite changed the URL over, so Jim was right. I sort of crossed my fingers as he typed in farmdatastandards.org.nz, thinking, what are you going to get? This is where we're going to end up eventually, and you'll see that this is actually GitHub. And so we've moved from those PDF documents, we've moved the same farm data standards into GitHub. We've made them, broken them down into much smaller components. There we are, components of land data interchange. That's what you were looking at before. And if we were looking at the definition of an application, we could click there and go through. I've probably chosen a page that isn't hooked up. Then we go into an animal one. I work more in the animal space, so I know what those look like. If I went and looked at characteristics of an animal, there is the characteristics of animals, including things like ISO 8601 birth date confidence, birth rank, etc., etc. And so what we're trying to communicate there is a typical representation, so a typical data type or representation, and then a description, which is about getting the semantics right. But to me, the exciting thing is moving this out of PDF, moving it into Markdown format in GitHub, licensing it under an Apache open source license. And what we're going to be doing is encouraging contributions from community. So if you have a particular area, say you work in, I don't know, viticulture, and you think that there's some work that needs to be done in that space, and the data dictionaries need to be extended in that space, then you can submit changes to those, and our maintainer will review them and merge them in. So to me, that's very exciting. Did you have any other questions, Jim?
No, I mean, it occurs to me that, when we look at this, which to me, obviously I'd want to dive into it and dig into it. It looks pretty impressive. And, that when considering where to do work and what organizations are doing and what resources they bring, one could take one or two mindsets about it. One could be, oh, well, we got our thing going on in New Zealand. Why would we, work to add to something in the US? Or another, and the US could have a similar kind of crazy idea. Or the other way could be, hey, the US has some good stuff. We have some good stuff. If we could work together and put them together, then it strengthens the implementability of the New Zealand stuff. And it also makes it more usable, or it would be usable in the United States, which would presumably help improve it and just almost certify its usefulness in other regions, and then maybe maybe the Netherlands would jump on board, things like that. Oh, I see you have ICAR up too.
Yeah, so just playing off what you were talking about, Jim, because you're exactly right. We got involved with when we started building the farm data standards in New Zealand. We said, well, we're not going to recreate what already exists elsewhere. So if there's a mapping data standard like OGC, we're just going to refer people to that. If we need to deal with invoiced data and those sorts of data, we're going to refer people to what AgGateway is doing. And if we need to talk to people about animal data, we're going to look at ICAR. And we found that the ICAR standard was in a very early stage. And so we became active contributors to that standard, effectively taking the messages we worked on with Data Linker and transforming those into the ICAR standard. So ICAR is about to, this week, hit their version 1.0 draft. And a lot of that is based on the work out of New Zealand, but being adopted in the Netherlands, in the US, in the Nordic countries, in Germany and the UK. So quite exciting to see that kind of international spread happening.
Yeah, and I see a reference up there in one of your commit notes about making it better for OpenAPI Spec 3.0, which I mentioned earlier. So yeah,
That's right.
It's fascinating that so many of these technologies, it's less about these days technical superiority, and it's more about tooling, what works, can you collaborate, and then the battles tend to be more of a political and a funding nature. Who's going to get this government funding, or maybe in some cases personalities, who wants attention and things like that. But man,
that's right.
The tools are there and the standards are there. It just takes some cooperation to make them work. So this is exciting. Thanks for sharing.
That's right.
Okay, so I guess we're going to transition to like Q&A that Tim and Kenneth will facilitate. I think I'm out of slides anyway.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, I've just invited, Tim's just emailing all attendees to invite any questions. Clearly from here, the direction is to continue on with this level of granularity and detail, particularly in data rights and data management. So we'll come to that information in webinar 3. I'm just keeping an eye on the chat column. I think, here we go. Tim's just asked, inviting all attendees. If you'd like to put out any questions forward, I can reference those and pass them on to Jim or Andrew. Where we're going from here, as I'm saying, is we're looking at webinar 3 is going to be on data rights and data management. That's anything from a clear to a very thorny issue. There are schools of thought. I'm sure all of us attending today will have views on not only the cost of creation, but also curation, transfer, storage, presentation, web interfaces. All of that work's got to be handled on a commercially sustainable basis. There is a very wide school of support that data is owned. The actual raw data is owned by, or let's be specific, farm data is owned by the farmer. But that doesn't mean its creation, storage, access, processing can be done at zero cost. There are service providers that can do that, but paying for that service is different than not finishing up with sovereignty over the data and the outcome of that. One question from Mike for Jim. Mike asks, how stable is ADAPT? I see it is on GitHub. Would you like to comment to that, Jim, please?
Sure, yeah. So ADAPT is in production for a number of companies. And so that includes John Deere, CNH, TopCon. John Deere has been very vocal that, hey, if you want access to our data, You know, you got to use adapt to make sense of it. Syngenta was very vocal at a meeting, at an AgGateway meeting we held in Basel, Switzerland at Syngenta's headquarters. They basically declared to the room, we are committed to using adapt for our field operations data model. So that speaks to some level of stability. Now, having said that, you know, there's always something that somebody else wants. Certainly people want it in a language other than C#. There is, as always, a certain degree of insiders know better. But on the flip side, hey, if you want to be an insider, you can. You don't have to be an AgGateway member, actually, to participate in adapt. That's one group in AgGateway that we have declared it open source, and it truly is. No need to even be a member. So, you know, there are people who will observe that, well, one device maker, not one that I've mentioned, they developed a plugin for version 1 of adapt, but they didn't update it for version 2. So, you know, I guess it comes down to how would one measure stability. And according to some measures, it's very stable in certain contexts. In other measures, in other contexts, maybe it's not where people want it. But at the end of the day, contribute, help make it better.
Thank you, Jim. Well, that moves elegantly to the second question from Shane, which is, I'll read it out. I can see how the use of existing standards can save time for developers. Where standards are lacking, how does a software company like us contribute to standards in its domain while helping its own business? He comments that we're a Microsoft shop, and so open source is not native to us. And he finishes with LOL, which I'm going to take means lots of laughs, not lots of love. Jim, would you like to that one?
Orlando Lakes in AgGateway.
Yeah, Orlando Lakes, yeah. Andrew, you could contribute to that one as well.
You know, I addressed this, I think it was, well, it was definitely last week. I don't know if it was in this session or the conference, but some solution providers or service providers, you know, Rezare Systems is one. Some of them get a bad rap, and frankly, they really deserve it. They try to sell an all-in-one solution in a way that makes you believe it's the only way. But then there are other companies who contribute to standards. There's one group, like in the United States, there's a company called AgIntegrated, and they invite anybody, hey, pay us money, send us your data, invoke our APIs, pass your data over, and we'll process it. Yes, you'll pay a fee. But at the end of the day, they also, even in their marketing materials, they say, we use adapt. And so as it relates to service providers are a critical element of making this whole ecosystem work. And it does sort of touch on some of the themes I addressed last week around competitive advantage. Clearly, if your software is the only software in the industry being used, and you use a proprietary format, your shareholders would have no problem with you keeping it proprietary and trying to keep competitors out. But hey, it's the Wild West. There's all sorts of systems and machinery and standards, and you just got to pick where you're going to collaborate and then say, hey, we're going to compete on this. But I'll tell you what, just being honest about things, which in AgGateway, we've achieved that. We've gotten to places where in a collaboration scenario, John Deere would say, nope, we're not going there. We're competing on that. So yeah, you guys can work on a standard if you want, but we're not going to support it. And then they contribute quite well to other standards, and they all work that way, TopCon and CNH. So there is a certain culture around making this stuff work. And solution providers are they can often be in no man's land, but they can help.
Yeah, and perhaps
Andrew,
I can just
comment?
I can perhaps add to that as well. In my experience, the biggest challenge for most, particularly smaller software companies who aren't the kind of the monopoly market leader, is finding the time. So there's clearly benefit in contributing, because it means that when you interface with other companies, or when people need to interface with you, you're doing it through a standard. You're not having to reinvent the wheel every time, all of those good things. And certainly in the work that we've done, we've seen multiple companies who are in the software and technology space, creating products who are competitors to each other, actively contributing and collaborating around the standard, which is fantastic. But there is that time investment. And I know we really struggle with it, because a lot of the work we do for our customers is bespoke work. We're effectively charging by the hour or by the achieved milestone. Can I justify to the customer spending the time contributing to the standards community? I know it will help their product, but I have to be able to justify that. So, Shane, I know exactly where you're coming from.
Scott, thank you for your question. It feels I sense that you've had that question answered. Thank you for the question. It was expanding on being able to determine or differentiate between when one would use a common standard for like an API, or where you'd keep something proprietary, where you've done it. I think probably you've expanded on that sufficiently. So thank you for that question, Scott. So I think that draws us to a natural pause in midway, 50% where time for oranges and half time, but no social, just remember social distancing. We are halfway there. We've got a second of the pair, webinar 3. The second of the pair is on data rights and data management. There'll be plenty of opportunities for robust debate, because I know it's an issue that's held in quite strong terms in some places, and there is often an expectation that simply because data exists about something, that the owner of the asset that data relates to automatically has free access to that data. I've often used the medical environment that I might get a blood test, and it'll give me information about my blood, but it doesn't mean to say that the nurse or the laboratory have to work for free simply because I want that data for myself. So those costs have to be borne, they have to be paid somehow, and that applies in the ag sector just like any other. That will set us up for webinar 4, which is in 2 weeks from today, and that's where we will have a very particular emphasis on the New Zealand application, which is why I call this series Insights and Applications, was to emphasise the ability of all of us, either together or in some other form, perhaps subgroups. By webinar 5, I'm going to invite everybody who would like to publish or to make available who's been attending. Obviously, that's been confidential until now, and appropriately so. But if you would like to make yourself known so that other colleagues can mix and mingle, share and exchange information, that's something you can consider between now and the end of the series. But we'll be inviting Andrew back in webinar 4. As I say, subject to David Downs being able to move a government meeting, we hope he can join us, and we'll take a particular emphasis, a particular look, I should say, at the implications of a transformed industry transformation plan. Let me emphasise, it's only me saying a transformed industry transformation plan. Over to the ministers whether they actually want to or not, but I think their plates are going to be very, very full, and it's an opportunity for industry to step up and contribute to and benefit from shared access and shared contribution where it's relevant. At the same time, we've all got businesses to run. Well over half, and nearly indeed 2/3 of the participants today, from what I can tell from email addresses, are running or working in commercial operations. We've got representation from academia, from research bodies, from industry good bodies, but the split is significantly different than the session that was convened in Wellington on the 26th of February, where the 70+% were from local and regional government and other not-for-profit organisations, if I can use that term loosely. So time's gone. Thank you for your attendance. Andrew, thank you for your guest contribution today. We appreciate your time and all your expertise and experience. You bring a lot to the industry generally, and we're very grateful for your contribution in this session. And of course, halfway mark round of applause goes to Jim. for your contribution. We appreciate that. This is supported by AgGateway and OAGi and Precision Ag Association, covering some of the costs of the webinar and other direct expenses. But all of us are very happy and grateful for your contribution. You've been a long-standing and long, a generous contributor to New Zealand, when I think some other AgGateway chapters have been started after you started working with us, and they're now upgoing and working and delivering value into their regions. So we'll get there in time, but I think that we needed to catch the right time frame. So thank you again. Thank you to all the attendees. We're finishing right on schedule, which is good. We look forward to seeing you again in a week. And in the meantime, make the most of the remainder of lockdown over the long weekend. And you can flap your wings a little from Tuesday, isn't it? So this time next week, we'll be ever so slightly have a foot off our neck, but we need to stay safe, take care of each other, and have a good day. And thank you for your attendance. Goodbye.